So I'm super excited to be doing this. I do want to answer that question on whether 60 decibels does anything in gender, because I feel like maybe we don't talk about it enough. And so we've actually spoken to 140,000 women across 70, more than 70 countries in local languages till date. And this is roughly 40% of all the surveys that we've conducted over the phone, which actually goes to show that you can listen to women over the phone, and the data that is collected through the process can inform strategies. And we've been able to do that for over 1,000 organizations. Now, I don't want to go too far into details about what 60 decibels does from a gender perspective, but a couple of things that I do want to share. And I'll just go back to the previous slide because it went went through too fast. But um, we collect actionable insights on the lived experience of women with the hope that the insights that we are collecting can help organizations that are directly supporting them or the funders of those organizations improve the support that they are providing. Some examples of the work that we've done have included needs assessment to gauge what support our clients are providing to new mothers in Kenya, or assessing the performance of job tech platforms, let's say in Bangladesh or in another part of the world, and then also measuring impact of financing for small businesses in various parts of the world. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we do, but I want to make sure that you know that this webinar is not about 60 decibels insights. Instead, what it's about is very much gender lens financing, understanding the evolution of this space, and of course, the role of data in that evolution. So we'll start with laying the groundwork of what's happened in the last 5, 10 years, and I'll lean on my colleague Rachna, who's joining us from the Dalberg team, to share a little bit about that evolution. After that, I'll move on to discussing a few creative ways in which data, and particularly customer data, is used to inform decisions in the space of gender lens financing. So whilst it's not about 60 decibels, it is about customer voice because that's at the center of what we do. And it is more importantly what each of the panelists that you will hear from and I share in common as our passion, both professionally and I guess I can say personally as well. The second topic for that, the second thing that we'll move on to in terms of the agenda will be Natasha talking to us, Natasha from Roots of Impact, talking to us on how Roots of Impact has incorporated gender lens within impact-linked financing. And finally, I'll bring in Raania from the Gates Foundation to speak a little bit about gender mainstreaming in the private sector context and the role of philanthropy in that. Now, most of this will actually just be about 25 minutes of conversation. And we really want to keep the lion's share of this discussion focused on a conversation between the panelists, but also, fueling that from the questions that you bring to the table. So a few housekeeping rules to that end. Please share your questions in the Q&A box, in the chat, and I'll try my best to moderate the discussion in a way that we answer as many of them as possible. We will share a recording of this conversation by email, so obviously take notes if you'd like, but you will have the recording in your inbox in 24 hours or so. And then we do, in sort of 60 decibels fashion, would love to get your feedback. At the end of this webinar, we obviously want to try to share the insights that we're collecting, but also the conversations that we're having that are interesting to us with as many organizations in our network as possible. So we hope that you can tell us which part, how we did on that objective and where we can do better. Okay, well, with that, I obviously have a poll, which my colleague Nadia will put up shortly. We had over 400 signups, and we forgot to ask you what organizations you were representing. So we're asking you now. Could you just tell us a little bit about which of these various categories of organizations most closely represents what persona you're taking on as you join this webinar today. And I guess I only see the results, Nadia, if I click a response. So I don't know if we can see what people are saying. Oh yeah, thank you. Oh, that's interesting. We have a bunch of investors and a bunch of NGOs. And not that many donors, a few TA providers, some enterprises, corporates. Always wonder what the other category is. So I don't know if you can see the poll results, but it looks like with 33% investors, and then there was a similar proportion of NGOs and enterprises as well. And with that, I have one more question, and then I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll get to the discussion part of this conversation. So this one is, if you had $1 million to invest with a gender lens, where would you put it? Nadia, can we see? What are we seeing as results? Maybe a few more votes. Oh, interesting. And a little bit unsurprising. I'm curious to hear what the panelists will think about this. With women-led businesses and entrepreneurs, financial services and products for women. Interesting that capacity building and leadership programs hasn't got as many votes. Well, let's see what our panelists might think about that as well. And I'll pose that question to our panelists as well. Let me stop sharing my screen and get to the discussion part of this agenda. All right. Like I said, our aim for today is to share a little bit from the perspective of few different organization and panelists what is and is not, what they've seen working and not working in the gender lens financing space. And I'd actually love to start with Rachna in this discussion. Rachna is a partner and a leader in the finance and investment practice at Dalberg. Dalberg, obviously, most of you may know, but many of you may know, is an advisory firm that solely focuses on global development challenges. She leads most of their work on women's empowerment and taking a gender equity and racial justice lens to investments. She's got extensive experience in this space and led the design of the criteria and requirements for 2X Challenge. I'm so glad I get to do these introductions. I can brag on your behalf. It is so delightful to have you with us, Rachna. Thank you for making the time. Over the last decade, you've really shaped the gender lens investing space, and especially the role of standards in gender lens financing, gender lens investing. Could you, from your perspective, give me an overview of how the field has evolved and situate us in where we are today?
Well, thanks, Venu. Thanks for inviting me here today. And thanks, everyone, for joining this conversation at a really important moment in the field. So my entry into the gender lens investing space began just under a decade ago. And I began to talk to our clients in the public, private, and philanthropic sectors that all said that they were investing in women in different ways. And what we found through those conversations is that there wasn't a shared terminology in terms of what gender lens investing was. There wasn't clear KPIs in terms of measuring the scale of gender lens investments, much less the impacts of those investments. And now that picture has changed dramatically in the past 8 or 9 years. So about 10 years ago, as we just sort of saw on the poll as well, a lot of folks were thinking about gender lens investing as investing in women entrepreneurs. And while that's still certainly the case, we know that women founders are typically underfunded compared to male founders, so that's still important. What we've seen is a much more holistic view of what it means to invest with a gender lens today. It's also about investing in organizations where women have senior leadership positions, where women have have a significant share of quality employment, where women are part of the supply chain, they're customers, they're part of the communities where there's investments, and they're also the ones that are making decisions in investment organizations themselves. And this sort of more expansive and holistic vision of what a gender lens investment is was captured by 2X many years ago. And as Venu, you mentioned, we were there and back in 2018 helping design the original criteria for 2X, and that's now been integrated in the IRIS Plus metrics and become this kind of global standard that I'm sure many on the line have sort of contributed to and helped refine over the years. And so as a result of this sort of shared terminology and shared metrics, we're able to really measure the growth of the market. So on the public side, Parallel Finance did some research last year, said that the fixed income market is around $16.5 billion. In the private market side, Project Catalyst also did some research, and they said that the private GLI fund market is anywhere between 8 and 14 billion, depending on the methodology used. And really, both public and private markets have shown steady growth year over year for the past decade. And so now we see that gender lens investing is happening across sectors, across regions, across asset classes, and across the risk return spectrum. And really, if we look beyond just sort of the size and the scale of the market, which has been significant, we also see a couple of different ways in which the market has become more mature, more nuanced as well. So GLI has really gone beyond just counting women to really valuing women. So data is being used not just to assess sort of percentage of women in the workplace, but also looking at metrics like pay equity, advancement and promotion in the workplace as well, that can really demonstrate impacts on women's lives. And that was always sort of the intent, but now we're actually seeing more and more investors trying to capture these types of metrics. We also see more of a conversation about thinking about women in all of their diversity. What are the unique challenges that women of color face, women from migrant communities face, really thinking about kind of unique challenges and solutions for them. The third thing that I've seen is more of an integration of gender considerations alongside other development considerations. So if we just look at the climate space, for instance, we know that women are often disproportionately impacted by climate challenges, and they can also be agents of change. So we've seen a lot more at the intersection of gender and climate investments, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years. The fourth change I'll mention is that there's more of a proactive look on gender transactions, whereas before we saw folks saying, okay, I'm looking at an agriculture transaction and I'm just going to screen it a little bit to see if there's a gender angle. Now we're really seeing people proactively look for gendered pipeline in terms of what is their deal flow. And then the last thing I'll mention, and there's many things I can mention, but the last thing I'll mention is perhaps just the growth of financial innovations we've seen. There's more blended finance transactions, there's more gender bonds, impact-linked finance, which I know Natasha is going to speak to, but a lot more innovation in this space as well. So really the scale of the market has been significant, and also the changes in the market have also been significant.
Well, that's actually really helpful. And we've had this conversation many times, and I feel like I've learned so much in the last few minutes of you describing the changes in the market. I guess the question that I'd like to ask next is, what do you think hasn't worked? And what might be some changes that GLI can bring about when it comes to thinking about data or using data to make decisions?
Yeah, I think data is, of course, essential and the purpose of this conversation. So first, some good news. We've seen more standardization of data due to 2X and other kind of standards that are out there. We've also seen a growing number of investors that are regularly measuring data. But in terms of sort of challenges or what we'd like to see looking forward, there's 3 things that probably come to mind. One is tracking data more consistently. So although more folks are tracking data, it could be more consistent. I'm still seeing some patchiness in the data that's being collected. Second, a lot of the data is still kind of operational data or screening data, but not really impact data. So that's an area of growth. And the third is the data is not yet being sufficiently used in decision making. So the 2X criteria, when we originally created them alongside the G7 DFIs, were always meant to be screening criteria. They're not meant to be impact metrics. They're really meant to be screening criteria. So the idea was that there were assumed impact pathways from those screens. So if you're investing in organizations with a significant number of women in leadership positions, you assume that that's going to create more inclusive workplaces where women are valued, and there's going to be higher retention rates for women and men. And there was some literature that sort of bore this out as well. There were also some assumptions that having more women in quality employment could also create stronger cultures and stronger retention as well. But the evidence there was a bit weaker, and we all know of feminized sectors that are not actually good for gender equity. So now it's been 7 or 8 years since the 2X criteria were created, and we have these really rich data sets. So if we analyze the data to understand which kind of investment screens led to real changes in women's lives and better financial returns, we could go back and actually change our investment screening and due diligence processes to really focus on investments that provide the most impact. And we've seen a number of organizations, particularly in the last 2 years, doing more evaluations of their own portfolios. We ourselves have done a number of evaluations. We just completed one for FMO. And I think there's getting to be a wealth of data on what is or is not working. So I think it's really exciting time in the data journey for GLI.
Oh, thank you, Rachna, for laying out that context of where we are as GLI, as an industry, as a sector. I guess I'd love to turn to Natasha next to understand a little bit more the investor angle, right? For those in the audience who don't know Natasha, she's a co-CEO, this co-CEO of Roots of Impact, which is a funder focused on impact-linked finance. Impact-linked finance is an innovation where impact is directly rewarded. Don't worry, I'll ask her to explain what impact-linked finance is before we get started. But just a couple of more things about Natasha and how impressive she is. She's worked in the space for almost 15 years, serving on multiple investment committees and/or TA advisory boards for SME funds. I'm just so excited to have you here, Natasha. You've had extensive experience working in financing, both at Roots of Impact, of course, but before that at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation. Could you please help us understand first what impact-linked financing is, maybe using an example? And then I'm curious to understand what trends you are seeing when it comes to gender becoming more of a live conversation a live theme in the context of impact-linked finance.
So much for having me, and thank you so much for saying such lovely things about me. It's done great things for my ego. It's wonderful to be here to answer your question. The simplest way to conceptualize impact-linked finance is that impact is at the heart of each and every financial transaction that we do. So enterprises are rewarded for creating positive outcomes as part of their investment round. So imagine a company who wants to deepen its impact and gets an impact-linked loan to do this. Every year, the impact outcomes that that company has created are assessed, and then they're verified. And the better the impact, the lower the interest rate, or as we like to call it, better terms for better impact. So a concrete example of this is a fintech that we're working with in India that provides asset-backed finance to people underserved by the formal financial markets. So the more this company can serve women, the better the outcomes, and the better the outcomes that they are able to create for these women, the lower the interest rate on their loan. So better terms for better impact, and that's what impact-linked finance is. Now, when we started doing impact-linked finance 8 years ago, we were completely sector agnostic. All we wanted to do was create as much impact as we could. And that is still true today. However, when we went back and we looked at all the transactions that we'd done over the last 8 years, we realized that completely unintentionally, over 50% of our deals had some element of gender in them, either in the selection of the company or in the metrics that these companies were being incentivized on. And why did we do this? Because that was just how we could create the most impact. We know that the business case for gender is well established, but we find that companies tend not to focus on deepening their gender impact just because it takes time and effort that could be used elsewhere. However, if we're able to reward this time and effort, then there is a case for them truly to dedicate focus and resources to deepening their gender impact. And that makes sense not only for the company, but for the communities that they operate in as well.
Thank you so much, Natasha. I know you had lost your voice 2 days back. So if I do have one more question for you, can I? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I think what's really interesting in the context in what you've shared is the question of exactly what metrics, and this isn't surprising, I'm clearly a data nerd, but I just wonder how you use data from multiple sources to figure out exactly how to understand impact of an impact-linked financing instrument. And when you do have data from multiple sources, which I assume you do, what role can customer voice play and how can it add value?
When we're tying financial rewards to impact, having good impact data is extremely important. And unfortunately, many of the enterprises that we work with don't have good IMM systems, and we often end up using operational data as an indicator of the impact that they're able to create. And it works most of the time. But there's only so far that operational data can take us in understanding impact, usually because it focuses on reach or scale. So how many women are reached, how many women get access, but it doesn't tell us anything about the depth, about the outcomes for these women. Are they better off than they were before? Does this actually improve their livelihoods? Does it give them a better sense of autonomy within their household? And these are the so what questions that can really take the impact to the next level. And this data comes from asking the customers. And in fact, this is exactly what we're doing with the fintech that I mentioned in India. Despite the fact that they knew how many women they had reached, they didn't have a comprehensive idea of the answers to the questions beyond the questions I mentioned about, what does this mean? Beyond anecdotal evidence and conversations they had. So we partnered with 60 Decibels to run a baseline survey, which in and of itself was incredibly enlightening for the company. And we'll run follow-up surveys each year to see how the company's impact on its women's customers changes over time. And the more impact that it has, the better the terms of its finance.
I'm so glad that that's how the data is being used, especially the data on depth of impact, because that's why we exist. All right, well, I guess next to Raania. Raania, I would love to turn to you to understand the donor perspective in this conversation. Raania, for those of you who don't know her, is a senior program officer at the Gates Foundation. She leads the Women's Livelihood Development Portfolio for Bangladesh and Pakistan, focusing on delivering opportunities for income generating livelihoods for low-income women. I've had the privilege of working with Raania on a couple of projects now. Raania, you partner a lot with the private sector on incorporating gender mainstreaming. So incorporating gender mainstreaming, being more intentional about women's economic growth. In that journey, what are the challenges and outcomes that you are seeing?
Hi, Venu, and hi to the audience. Thank you so much for inviting me today. Fully acknowledging the challenges of pursuing gender equality in any sector, I want to reframe challenges as opportunities as we speak through this. So then the opportunity is about identifying why gender integration and mainstreaming is important for the business that we're talking about or the organization. And what does it do for their business case and long-term sustainability? Because eventually they will need to take it on beyond funding and technical assistance. And this includes identifying sort of the organizational DNA and understanding how specific gender-sensitive pathways could be part of that DNA. It's obviously a lot easier when you're with a startup who are just developing their DNA and you can be part of that development. So an example of this is Shramvob in Bangladesh, which is a job tech platform targeting low income communities for blue and silver colored jobs. So the labor force, the real labor force of Bangladesh. And the reason that they started this platform was, some of the reasons behind it were about reducing information asymmetrics in these communities, understanding that women are often in danger when they go through a middleman and so on, and even men. And really trying to get low-income segments to be able to use digital ways of looking for jobs and being matched with employers. The funding from the Gates Foundation has enabled Shramvob to consider and implement gender mainstreaming. They've been better able to deep dive into understanding the job market for low-income women and what restrictions they faced, what constraints they faced in entering that job market. And also the digital gaps, because remember, we're talking about a job tech platform here, right? and what has inhibited their use in the platform, like skilling, for example. They've worked really hard through funding on improving the user experience on that platform for women, which is important as well. They've engaged with employers to try and improve the way that employers present things and the real working conditions for women. And they've also had a lot of outreach into communities. From sort of outcomes point of view so far, like if we talk about pre-funding and post-funding, what we're seeing is that there's almost like 43,000 more women who are active users on the platform since we started funding Shambhav. It's just such an impressive number for me. I'm so proud of them. If we sort of skip the life cycle of how you get onto the platform and use the job to the end bit, I would say that in terms of job applications, this has gone from 83,700 in October 2023 prior to funding, and right now it stands at 510,500.
Wow, that
So
is
pretty impressive as we go through it.
that's so impressive. And as a program officer, how are you thinking about using various types of data to understand progress and gender inclusion from your perspective?
That's a great question, Venu. So in August 2024, we partnered with 60 Decibels and Shambhav to understand the gender trends on the platform. And the survey that you and I designed with so much of our time, Venu, it was great working with you, by the way, was carefully designed to capture the entire experience of women on that platform. So not just them being a user, but how do they get through to actually accepting a job and stay in that job? So the place jobs, as they call it. And there were so many outcomes that were so important to design, but I'm going to outline two. So the first one was about how we can use customer data and voice and to reach customers in a more meaningful way. And this was, once women were on the platform, there was a 2 in 5 drop-off rate between placements. They received a job offer, didn't take it, or they took a job offer, accepted it, and didn't stay in that job for long enough. And 60 Decibels was able to use the data surveys to really understand why this was happening. And this helped Shambhav to understand that a lot of this was about geolocations. Employers weren't putting a geolocation, it wasn't a requirement on the platform until the 60 Decibel survey really highlighted that it was important to women. So they have put a GPS location. They've stipulated it on employers now. It's part of the app. The app has been adapted. And what it has resulted in terms of programmatic internal data, so not the 60 Decibels data, but since that 60 Decibel survey, is that all of those women who were surveyed, of those, 61% of females are benefiting from the geolocation. So benefiting doesn't always mean that they're in jobs. It means that they've had more agency in choosing whether they want to pursue that opportunity or not. So I see that as a great result for women. Equally, one of the most important findings from this data for us in my team was that the large majority of female users and those placed in jobs were university graduates. And whilst we fully acknowledge that even university graduates can be low income, this is not quite the segment that my team generally reaches out to. And it wasn't the segment that Shambhav had wanted to reach out to at the beginning of all of this. So working with the customer voice data, this was just a finding. It was a finding that we're reaching more women who are educated at university level than low-income, uneducated women. And Shambhav wanted to stay with reaching out to low-income women. So they've actually developed work streams, working with employers to try to do this now. And there's been some great results. I just want to do a caveat here, which says that like in South Asia, job tech platforms that try to reach low-income and uneducated women normally collapse. It's happened to me twice in the role that I've been in, where job tech platforms have just gone bankrupt because there's not much demand from employers to get to that segment. Shambhav has actually done this great thing where they've identified DEI, like the requirement for DEI in companies in manufacturing, food delivery, and retail as a requirement, and we've spoken to these companies. And they've sort of found that these companies really do want to reach low-income women who are not educated, and they're working with that. So a really quick example is Singer, the sewing company in Bangladesh. They have committed recently to recruiting 90 female operators, which was not the case before the survey was done with Shambo by 60 decibels. So this is like, and this all goes back to how you pivot design to have more impact on the target group that you're working with.
Sorry, you'd think I know how to unmute myself, but that's actually really fascinating. I didn't know the other example and what you were working on. And I'm so glad that Shambhav was able to use those results in so many ways. Just a question to everyone before we get to, just answering the stream of questions that are coming from the audience. You're obviously seeing them in the Q&A box, but there's a whole bunch else that's coming in other ways. I would just love to take a moment to acknowledge the reality that we're in today and how the future of gender lens financing may have looked quite different to this group, to everyone on the call a few weeks back. The space of international development has gone through some pretty big shifts recently. And we did get a number of questions from, across the board on how each of you feel that these shifts have impacted your priorities for this space, and what can investors and practitioners do to keep up the progress that the space has made. And a lot of the stats that each of you have shared, especially Rachna at the beginning, shows significant progress. So I'll just leave it there and see, who wants to jump in with a response, and maybe, we build on this together as a discussion as we go into Q&A.
I'm happy to start us off. I mean, we're an intermediary organization, right? Not an investor ourselves. So I can maybe share a little bit about what we're hearing from our clients, which really span again from public to private sector. So we've seen that some people are just kind of pausing, waiting, watching, seeing how things may evolve over the next couple of months before making decisions. Some are actually stepping away from sort of gender or any work that's framed as DEI. Some are going to continue to do the work, but sort of just integrate it as regular business operations and sort of stop using the language of gender lens investing, both internally and externally. Some are going to still do the work, but be a little bit more circumspect in terms of how they frame it externally. And some are doubling down. And so they're both doing the work and being really bold about this. And a little bit uncolored by the fact that I sit in the US and in New York. And so I'm hearing a little bit more from US-based investors, but this is broadly what we're hearing across the field. And I'm sure my fellow panelists have thoughts in terms of what we can do to continue progress. But I think two asks that will be made, or two shifts that we might be seeing, is more demand for the business and the impact case to justify, quote unquote, continued investments. And in some ways, I'm sure many on the call feel this as well, that feels frustrating to get asked that question, because we've seen all of this progress over the last decades and feels like we've sort of answered that question already. And so it shouldn't be coming up again. At the same time, though, I just talked about how we have all this amazing data now. And so there's maybe this opportunity to be able to use that data to not only make the case as that's being asked, but also to improve the way that decisions are made as well. So that's sort of something that's being pushed upon us, but also is potentially an opportunity as well of how we use data. The second thing that I think we might see a little bit more is more just integration of gender considerations into ESG frames or just core business operations. So if a business is trying to scale, they may be asking male and men and women customers, how do you want this product to work for you? How could I adapt my product for you? And that's just good business operations, to think about your customers and to adapt your product accordingly. And so it's just going to be integrating gender considerations into normal business operations. And in many sense, this is what many folks in the GLI space wanted all along, is for gender not to be considered some different niche impact only thing, but just part of the good way of doing business. So I think these are in some ways things that are being pushed upon the field, but can be turned into positives as well.
Raania, I see that you've unmuted.
Oh, I was continually on mute, but I think so never waste a crisis, right? And we're in a crisis situation. As I said at the beginning of speaking to you, Venu, that to understand where the opportunities are and to see these these constraints as opportunities, these challenges as opportunities. I am very enlightened by what Rachna just said, because I don't work so much in the US as such. I work in Bangladesh and Pakistan. So far, the companies I work with have not quite been hit by the need to reframe. But that doesn't mean that at one point, as an institution, we will have to consider things. I think it really is about being more intentional, more impactful, streamlining more, so that there is space for better business cases.
Resonate with both with what Rachna and Raania have said. I don't know what's going to happen over the next few years. I'm not sure that any of us do, but I do know that my colleagues and I, as I mentioned, we never started incentivizing gender impact because of an enabling policy environment. We did it because we wanted to have the most impact possible, and we could achieve that by focusing on women. And nothing about that has changed. So we will continue to do that in whatever shape we can. And that may mean that we have to shift our focus from implementation to advocacy for a little while. But I don't think that we should ever stop talking about the power of supporting women to change the world. And as so much has been said about this today, data will really be key to that message, and telling stories of women will be key to that message.
Such thoughtful reflections. Thank you. Natasha, actually piggybacking on that, there was a question from the audience on how exactly you use data to define incentives. So how does Roots of Impact decide which companies they use 60 decibels for, and how do you cover the costs of the data collection?
So, and there's a couple of similar questions in the Q&A.
Exactly.
So we like to look at both when we're considering the impact to be incentivized, both the breadth and the depth, and then also the duration of the impact created. So I think a lot of focus today is put on reach, how many women are reached, as I mentioned. That is definitely one component, and it's an important component, and we like to matrix that with the depth of the depth of impact as well. And I think that's where, depending on the organization we're working with, some organizations have this data and some don't. And when they don't, we really find that then it's incredibly powerful to bring in a 60 decibel survey to support them in understanding the depth of impact that they're having, and also how they can deepen that impact. We have been we recognize that in order for this to happen, we want to, as much as possible, support the companies to be able to do that. So when we are doing this, we usually negotiate with funders upfront to be able to build the costs of that into the fund design, so that it doesn't come at a cost to the companies themselves. And it serves a dual purpose of not just understanding their baseline and how much they're deepening impact, but also being a third party verifiable data source that can then be used to tie the incentives to, on top of the operational data that we spoke about already. I hope that answers the question.
Certainly answers mine, and I think you ended up touching on a number of other questions that are similar. I guess well, there's so many, I don't even know how to pick. So, Rachna, I just want to direct a question to you on perhaps, what data do you think can actually capture women's agency, and can data actually do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Venu. And actually, before I go there, I just wanted to pick up on Natasha's point as we think about this particular moment, and you do it because you think it's the right thing to do. I think that's really important. And another thing that really strikes me, again, sitting in New York, sitting in the US in this moment, is the importance of spaces like this. I think sort of acting as a solo actor, speaking out about what you want, can sometimes feel scary. And in different moments and times of global change and turbulence, it feels particularly scary to be the one on LinkedIn LinkedIn, to be the one on social media, to be the one on public forums talking about why gender, DEI, diversity, inclusion is important. And so I think having groups like this where collectively they're a group of voices talking about this important, sharing ideas, sharing what's working or not is incredibly important. And I feel that more and more every day, frankly, where I sit. And so just to plus one to what Natasha said, and really appreciate you, Venu, for kind of bringing us together. Okay, so to the question in terms of agency, this is something that I was excited to answer because it's something that we looked into a couple of years ago as we were trying to think about how can you measure the true impact of sort of gender screened investments. And as you think about sort of traditional women's economic empowerment frames, it's easier to measure things about access or participation in economic life or even increased incomes. But things like agency, we found a lot harder. And so we kind of talked to a different range of investors in terms of what they were doing. And I saw one or two questions about this in the Q&A as well. The things that we heard that folks were doing that were interesting were surveys or sort of qualitative insights. But sometimes there was also some assessments of quantitative insights through surveys, again, were possible. So it were things like gender disaggregated uptake of workplace policies, really trying to assess whether men versus women felt more comfortable taking advantage of vacation days, leave days, flexible work policies, et cetera. That was one sort of imperfect proxy of agency. Another one was about percentage of respondents that report increased decision-making at the workplace or at the home, or gender disaggregated perceptions of safety at work, ability to speak up at work. So all of these are imperfect proxies of agencies, but different ways to start to get at it. So it's something that I'm still very curious about. So also I'd love to hear from folks in the chat as well about what they're doing to try to measure it.
Absolutely. And I think we've gone through a similar journey at 60 decibels as well, because no one data point is perfect when it comes to measuring agency. And I think it's because women's empowerment isn't binary, like changes in agency aren't binary. There are aspects which can improve, and there are other aspects that still need to improve. And so as long as you can identify what those aspects are and try to understand directly from the end customer whether they believe or in their behaviors you see changes that reflect progress towards improved agency, that's the most that anyone can really measure. Raania, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. I know
I
the Gates
wanted to
Foundation
add
spent
to that, actually,
yeah,
just what you're saying, Venu and Rachna, that agency is very much rooted in the social norms concept, right? So what is agency for one person isn't enough agency for another. And I think customer voice can really help in understanding, engaging cultures and the cultural impact on agency and power relations and what we need to do to get it to a point of real impact. But, like you said, the agency is not binary. It's not yes, no, and, it's quite subjective when you speak to anybody, whether you speak to a female or a male. So I do think that we need to start to factor in what the influences are around what actually dominates the narrative around agency in that particular space.
thanks so much, Raania. And Rachna, there are examples being shared of how other people are doing it. So thank you for asking the audience to engage. Just, pivoting a little bit from the specifics of what to measure, there are a few questions that are coming up about what is working. So there are questions about, can you share examples of intentional gender impact strategies being brought into the design of a project in sectors where women are underrepresented? Now, that's a little bit of a loaded question, but I wonder if that's bringing up, if any of you have examples that you could possibly share. So
Yeah.
intentional gender impacts. Yeah, go ahead, Natasha. You understood the question.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just
Go
going to
ahead,
say that
Natasha. Go ahead, and then I'll add to you.
I hope this isn't a disappointing answer. I definitely don't think we have a one-size-fits-all gender impact strategy. But what we have found that works really nicely and is able to work in multiple different contexts is the combination of technical assistance for gender and then tying incentives to that. So having a gender action plan be built in partnership with the enterprise itself, taking into account their strategy and their goals, and looking at all the ways that they can contextually within the sector and the space and the context that they're in, deepen their gender impact, and then having our impact incentives tie into that gender action plan, we found be a very, very powerful way of providing not only the tools and the roadmap to get to a point of deeper gender impact, but then also the support and resources and incentives to make that happen.
And I think one follow-up question, Natasha, which might come from a few people, is who funds the gender action plans, the TA?
We have some great funders who have been generous enough to put together a package that involves both technical assistance and impact incentives, and so that comes as a package transaction.
Thanks, Natasha. Heading to you, Raania. You wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think Natasha's actually covered it, so maybe we can move on to an alternative question.
Absolutely. I think the second set of questions on what is working and is not working is around the nexus of gender and climate. People are curious to see what each of you have seen working at that nexus, or a subset of you. Doesn't have to be each of you.
I can go first. I can't say that I can definitively attest to something working, but a couple of one of the interesting things we're doing from our team is to fund a carbon trading platform, which has a gender co-benefit to it. It's just in its sort of at a point where the MVP is ready and it will launch, but really just being able to encourage those who want to trade carbon credits to also invest in the gender co-benefit too. So trading more towards women using certain types of climate safe products than men. So it's interesting. It's still in the stages of being implemented. We're nearly there, and I can keep everyone posted. But yeah, just again trying to find the financial benefit for both the supply and the demand is really important here.
This one, and like Raania, we've got a gender and climate fund that is nearly there, not quite there, but nearly there. And the way we're looking at this is really a combination of inclusivity metrics. So looking at who is served. So whether that's vulnerable or underserved women, what is the access element to that? And then on the other side, again in this kind of matrix approach, what is the effect on those women's livelihoods of the usage of these products and services? So kind of a two-pronged approach on the inclusivity and then on the effect on livelihoods.
I was on mute. We have, going back to the data-related questions. There's a question that says, beyond disaggregating data, what gender conceptual frameworks are you using to design data collection with women and analysis of that data? Any conceptual frameworks that come to mind? It's okay if not. We can always get back to the audience with answers to these questions. All right, then there are a few follow-up questions on TA. So coming from the perspective of a TA facility, what practical steps and best practices can TA providers take on to help gender lens businesses become more investment ready? Particularly in a rural and informal economies context. So I think, Natasha, this is actually one step before what you had described in your previous example. I don't know if you have any further thoughts to add to that description.
The work that we've done with TA providers has been at the stage where we're providing impact-linked finance, and not so much at the readiness stage. But I think one thing that we found that would be relevant at all stages is the one-size-fits-all solution doesn't always work. that different contexts, different stage of businesses require have different needs. And we've definitely had the most success when we have taken included an element of context specificity and understanding of the specific business's needs into technical assistance. And to caveat with this, that we partner, we don't provide the TA ourselves. But I've always been really impressed with our TA partners who take the time to fully understand the business's needs before jumping into capacity building for them.
I just want to plus one what Natasha says as well. I think sometimes I hear in this space, okay, the GLI field has matured so much. There's so many toolkits, there's so many frameworks, there's so much that's out there. Do we really need customized TA? And I would, just plus one what Natasha was saying, like, yes, you still do, because every context is different, every organization is different, and so they have different needs. And then coming back to the data question, I think one of the ways that TA providers can really help organizations in any context become investment ready is by having really clear, goals and targets in terms of what their gender outcomes that they seek to achieve are, whether it is about gender diversity internally, reaching customers, et cetera, but saying this is actually what the target is. I'm aiming to reach it in the next 2 years, and here are the specific steps. Then TA providers can actually develop an action plan for organizations to take to show progress towards that. And for an investor, even if somebody is sort of not considered a pure gender investment right now, if they have a clear action plan, they have a real sort of target that they're striving towards, that can be positive to get investors on board. And that's where I think TA and investment can really come together nicely.
Yeah, echoing both Natasha and Rachna, and is how I started speaking about Sean Bob, that it's about looking at the company's DNA. And if every company is different, every company has different measures and different levels of impact that they want to reach on gender mainstreaming, right? So it's very much about tailored responses. The toolkits are great, and you leveraging toolkits, but then being able to leverage the toolkit to come up with a tailored solution for that company and that mission.
Thank you. I think I have time for maybe one more question, and something that somebody said in the Q&A box really resonated. So beyond trying to do more improving the business case, who is, like, I should probably attribute this to you. It's Cesar. Maita, you said something about beyond trying to do more improving the business case. My sense is that, now I'm quoting you, it is also more about power. Do you see any opportunities to influence more and perhaps influence differently as a community of gender lens investing? It's not just to the panelists. Honestly, anyone can answer in the chat. We're sorry we couldn't unmute everyone. It's a large group, but curious to hear any thoughts.
I'm happy to kick us off with some ideas. And hi, Cesar, good to see you on here. I think it's some of the things that we mentioned before. I do think, sadly, it is about making the business case. And it feels like, okay, we've moved beyond that. Everyone knows the business case. But I think in this moment of time, it is particularly important to make it over and over and over again. It isn't a nice to have. It isn't because we want to be nice to women. It's because it just makes your business and your investment better. Yes, it's also the right thing to do, but it's also good for your business. And sometimes that's kind of an instrumentalist argument, but it sometimes can be effective as well. And I'd also say, and just echoing what I said before, there is power in a group, power for folks to come together and say this is important, power for folks to continue the conversation, power for folks to say, no, our voices should not be erased. These words should not be erased from the investment lexicon. So this group and other groups continuing to talk about this and kind of sort of continuing to beat that drum, I think is really essential, because, it's easy to stand on the sidelines. It's easy to sort of say, okay, this moment will pass, or, let's not make waves. And that's very understandable. understandable in this moment of time, but I also think it's important, to retain your power, to shift that power is to take power, and having power as a group is very important. Women are a large majority of the global population. They're an increasing voice in the investment landscape. And so I see lots of plus ones. So hopefully that resonates with folks as well for groups like these to continue to come together.
I love that question and absolutely love what you said about that, Rachna. I think it is it's in some ways one and the same, talking about the business case, talking about why this matters, bringing it all together, continuing the conversation, making sure that these voices are heard, not just the voices talking about it, but the voices of the women on the ground through the surveys. This is really what is going to make the difference. And I love that we have the space to have these conversations and talk about that. That is exactly as you said, Rachna, that is where the power is. So a big thanks, Venu, a big thanks 60 Decibels for bringing us together, because this is just incredibly powerful in and of itself.
Yeah, to add to Rachna and Natasha, Rachna, I love what you said. And I was about to say, Natasha, that it's the power, it's about dissemination and collaboration, but it's also about the power of the end user and making sure that we're able to capture that and utilize it for the business case, so that we come back to a full circle in some ways. So really, again, how do you capture the user power? How do you capture the mass of voices and be able to analyze it in a way that makes sense to decision makers? So I think for me, that's a great way to close my side of this webinar.
Thank you. I couldn't have done better closing remarks. So thank you for those closing thoughts. We will be sharing, there's going to be a feedback link in the chat imminently. And we will obviously share it by email. Thank you everyone for making time. Thank you for the panelists for making time to share your thoughts, and especially on some of the difficult topics that we can find hard to talk about sometimes. But I'm glad we had this space, and I hope to continue this conversation offline with many of you. Right. Take care, everyone. Bye.